I'm Victoria, 35 years old, and right now I'm packing the last box from the mansion I called home for 12 years. Yesterday I signed divorce papers while my husband Marcus kept everything from his father's $210 million inheritance. But this morning, an elderly lawyer showed up at my door with a sealed envelope that changed everything. Marcus thought he'd won by taking it all, but his father had other plans. Before I tell you what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with your whole heart, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story might just give you hope that justice still exists in this world. I met Marcus at a charity gala in Manhattan when I was 23 years old. I was working as a nonprofit coordinator for a children's literacy foundation, barely making ends meet but loving every minute of helping kids discover the magic of books. Marcus Preston walked into that ballroom like he owned it, which technically he almost did since his family had donated the building. He was heir to Preston Industries, a manufacturing empire worth billions that his grandfather had started in a garage 70 years ago. What surprised me wasn't his confidence or his perfectly tailored tuxedo. It was how he spent the entire evening in the corner with the kids we'd brought from the foundation, reading them stories while other guests networked over champagne. When 7-year-old Maria spilled juice on his $3,000 shoes, he just laughed and told her they looked better with polka dots. That's when I fell for him, watching this billionaire heir kneel on the floor teaching kids to sound out words. Our romance moved fast in that intoxicating way that makes you believe in fairy tales. Marcus pursued me with handwritten letters delivered to my tiny Brooklyn apartment, not with expensive gifts but with books he thought I'd love, each one inscribed with notes about why it reminded him of me. My friends warned me about the difference in our worlds. His mother Patricia made it clear at our first meeting that I wasn't the type of woman she'd envisioned for her son. But Marcus stood up to everyone, telling them that I was the first person who saw him for who he really was, not just his bank account. We married at the Preston family estate in the Hamptons on a perfect June day. What I remember most from that day wasn't the 500 guests or the orchestra or the dress that cost more than I'd made in 3 years. It was Marcus's father, George, pulling me aside during the reception. This titan of industry, this man who could make CEOs tremble with a phone call, took my hands and said something that seemed odd at the time. He said, "Victoria, you have something my son needs, something money can't buy, which is the ability to see the truth in people's hearts. Promise me you'll never lose that gift, no matter what happens." The early years of our marriage were everything I'd dreamed. Marcus was running a smaller division of Preston Industries, learning the business from the ground up at his father's insistence. I continued my charity work, but now with the resources to make real change. We bought a brownstone in the Upper East Side, not the flashiest neighborhood, but one where kids still played on the stoops and neighbors knew each other's names. Marcus would come home from work and find me covered in finger paint from the after-school program I'd started, and he'd join right in his Armani sleeves rolled up as he helped kids with homework. George became more than just my father-in-law during those years. While Patricia remained cold and distant, George sought out my company. He'd invite me to lunch, just the two of us, and we'd talk for hours about everything except business. He wanted to know about my childhood in Ohio, about my parents who died when I was 19, about what made me choose nonprofit work when I could have done anything with my degree. He started including me in family business discussions, asking my opinion on company decisions. Marcus was proud, at first joking that his father had better taste in dinner companions than he did. When our twins Emma and Ethan were born, George's joy transformed him. This man who'd built an empire became a grandfather who'd slip out of board meetings to attend preschool plays. He'd sit on our living room floor for hours building block towers for the babies to knock down his face, lighting up at their laughter. He started teaching me chess during those long Sunday afternoons, while the babies napped, and each game came with life lessons disguised as strategy tips. He'd say things like, "Remember, Victoria, sometimes the most powerful piece on the board isn't the one that looks strongest, it's the one that sees 3 moves ahead." But as Marcus took on more responsibility at Preston Industries, something in him began to shift. The man who used to rush home to read bedtime stories started missing dinners. The husband who'd write me love notes on napkins began criticizing my appearance, suggesting I dress more like the other executives' wives. When George promoted Marcus to executive vice president, the change accelerated. Marcus became obsessed with proving himself worthy of the Preston name, and somehow I'd become a liability in that equation rather than an asset. George noticed the change too. His health was declining. Heart problems the doctors said came from 60 years of 16-hour days and too much scotch. But he made more effort to spend time with me and the children, often when Marcus was traveling for business. During what would be our last chess game, George made an unusual comment. He said, "Victoria, I've made many mistakes in my life, some that can't be undone. But I want you to know that you're the best thing that ever happened to this family. You brought heart to a dynasty built on steel and ambition. No matter what happens when I'm gone, remember that you earned your place here through love, not law." George's heart attack came on a Tuesday morning in his office. His secretary called me not Marcus, and I held his hand in the ambulance as he struggled to breathe. His final words, whispered so quietly I almost missed them, were, "Protect what matters, Victoria, the will knows the truth." I thought he was confused from the lack of oxygen, mixing up his final wishes with some business deal. Marcus arrived at the hospital after George had already passed his first words, not about his father, but about whether George had said anything about the company's succession plan. The funeral was a study in contrasts. While I handled the intimate details, George would have wanted making sure his favorite poems were read and his beloved jazz quartet played. Marcus worked the crowd of business associates like it was a networking event. I watched him smile and shake hands discussing merger opportunities, while his father's body lay in a casket 20 feet away. Patricia stood like an ice sculpture accepting condolences with the same expression she used for board meetings. Only the children seemed to truly mourn, asking when Grandpa would wake up and play chess again. The will reading took place in George's study 3 days later. Edmund Hartley, who'd been George's lawyer for 40 years, looked older than I'd ever seen him. The room was full of family members and business associates, all leaning forward like vultures waiting for their portion of the feast. Edmund's voice shook as he began reading the formal language about George being of sound mind and body. The estate was valued at $210 million, not including his controlling interest in Preston Industries, which was worth substantially more. Then Edmund read the words that changed everything. "To my son, Marcus Preston, I leave my entire estate and controlling interest in Preston Industries on the condition that he remains married to Victoria Preston. In the event of divorce initiated by Marcus or caused by his actions, all assets will transfer to the Victoria Preston Foundation for Children's Literacy, with Victoria Preston as sole trustee." The room exploded. Patricia actually gasped, her perfect composure cracking for the first time I'd ever seen. Marcus grabbed my hand, not in affection, but possession. His fingers digging into my skin as he processed what this meant. But Edmund wasn't done. He pulled out a sealed envelope marked with additional instructions. "This secondary document is to be opened only upon certain circumstances, which have been outlined in a separate letter held in my personal safe. The contents are known only to myself and Mr. George Preston, deceased." Edmund's eyes met mine for just a moment, and I saw something there that looked like pity, or maybe protection. Marcus was already on his phone with his own lawyers before we even left the room, his voice low and urgent as he confirmed the terms were ironclad. That night Marcus was almost manic in his affection toward me. He promised we'd be partners in everything, that his father's will just proved how important I was to the family legacy. He made love to me for the first time in months, whispering about our future, the empire we'd build together. But even as he held me, I could feel his mind working, calculating. When he thought I was asleep, he got up and made more phone calls from his study. I heard him say, "We need to find a loophole, there has to be something we can use." Patricia's hostility toward me intensified immediately. At the board meeting where Marcus was confirmed as CEO, she introduced me to investors as the woman who has my late husband's attention, the implication clear that I'd somehow manipulated George. She began spreading rumors in our social circles that I'd influenced George during his illness, that I'd taken advantage of an old man's loneliness. Friends who'd known me for years suddenly questioned whether I'd married Marcus for money all along. The whispers followed me everywhere, even to my charity events where donors now looked at me with suspicion instead of respect. The business vultures started circling within weeks. Companies that wanted to acquire Preston Industries knew Marcus needed full control to make deals. They offered him astronomical sums contingent on him having complete ownership without any marital complications. I found correspondence he'd left on his desk proposals that would make him one of the richest men in America if only he could remove the marriage clause. One letter from a Chinese conglomerate specifically stated their offer was void if any ownership remained with his spouse. Then I discovered the affair. It was almost cliché in its obviousness. Diane Chambers was Preston Industries' lead corporate attorney, Harvard Law. Came from old money, everything Patricia had wanted in a daughter-in-law. I found the credit card charges, first dinners at restaurants I'd never been to, hotel rooms in the middle of the day when Marcus was supposedly in meetings. But what hurt most was finding their text messages on our shared cloud account where Marcus called her his real partner and said I was just a temporary problem to solve. The campaign to destroy me began subtly. Marcus would start arguments in front of the household staff, raising his voice, while keeping his words just vague enough. He'd accuse me of spending too much money, though I hadn't bought anything for myself in months. He'd question my parenting in front of the children, suggesting I was too permissive, too distracted by my charity work to be a good mother. Each fight was carefully orchestrated to have witnesses who could later testify to my instability. I found a document on his computer titled Operation Freedom. It was a detailed plan created with Diane's help outlining how to force a divorce while protecting his assets. They'd researched precedence cases where inheritance conditions had been overturned due to spousal misconduct or mental incompetence. The plan included staged incidents, manufactured evidence, and a timeline that ended with me leaving with nothing while Marcus kept everything. There were notes about making me look unstable, unfit, even dangerous. The gaslighting intensified daily. Marcus would hide my car keys, then berate me for losing them in front of our friends. He'd tell the children I'd promised them things I never had, making me look like a liar when I couldn't deliver. He changed passwords on our bank accounts, claiming I'd been confused about our finances. When I confronted him about Diane, he laughed and said I was paranoid, that therapy might help with my delusions. He even suggested to our friends that I'd been acting strange since George's death, that grief had affected my mind. The children became weapons in his war. Marcus started taking them on elaborate trips without me buying them everything they asked for, while telling them Mommy needed alone time. He enrolled them in activities during my scheduled time with them, making me choose between letting them down or looking controlling. Emma came home one day and asked why I didn't love Daddy anymore, repeating words that sounded rehearsed. Ethan stopped running to hug me when I picked them up from school, looking confused about whose side he should take. Patricia escalated her own attacks, spreading increasingly vicious rumors. She told her book club that I'd been having an affair with Edmund Hartley. That's why George had changed his will. She informed the charity board that I'd been embezzling funds, producing doctored financial documents that looked authentic enough to demand an investigation. Even though I was cleared, the damage was done. The foundation I'd built from nothing asked me to take a leave of absence until things settled down. My life's work destroyed with a few strategic lies. Then came the police report. Marcus claimed I'd threatened him during an argument, that I'd thrown a vase at his head and screamed I'd kill him if he left me. The vase had indeed broken after he'd knocked it off the table himself when I wasn't even in the room. But the housekeeper who Marcus had recently given a substantial raise corroborated his version. 2 officers showed up at Emma's school play to serve me with a temporary restraining order. The humiliation of being escorted out while other parents filmed on their phones was exactly what Marcus had planned. The restraining order prohibited me from entering Preston Industries properties and required supervised visitation with my children. Marcus's lawyer argued I was a danger to myself and others, presenting edited recordings of our arguments, where my responses to his provocations sounded unhinged without context. The judge, who happened to be a member of Marcus's golf club, granted every restriction they requested. Within 48 hours, I went from being Mrs. Preston to being a threat requiring court supervision to see my own children. My bank accounts were frozen based on Patricia's embezzlement accusations. Credit cards stopped working in the middle of grocery shopping. The car technically owned by the company was repossessed from my friend's driveway where I'd been staying. Marcus had systematically removed every resource I had access to, leaving me with nothing but the clothes I'd packed in a hurry. Friends who'd promised to stand by me went silent when Marcus's lawyers sent them warnings about interfering in an ongoing legal matter. The ultimatum came through Diane, who smiled as she delivered it in person. Marcus was offering me a clean divorce with a modest settlement of $50,000 if I left quietly, and agreed never to discuss our marriage publicly. If I fought, they'd pursue criminal charges for embezzlement, assault, and child endangerment. They had witnesses, documents, recordings, everything needed to not just divorce me but destroy me completely. I had 72 hours to decide. I sat in my friend Sarah's guest room that night, holding a bottle of sleeping pills, wondering if Marcus had won. The man I'd loved, who'd read stories to sick children, who'd held my hand through my parents' funeral anniversary every year, had become a monster I didn't recognize. Or maybe the monster had always been there, hidden behind the fairy tale I'd wanted to believe. I pulled out my phone to look at pictures of Emma and Ethan, their faces the only thing keeping me from swallowing those pills. That's when I noticed a text from an unknown number. It simply said, "George knew. Check with Edmund tomorrow morning. Don't sign anything." The divorce proceedings were a massacre disguised as justice. I sat at the defendant's table with a public defender who'd met me 20 minutes before the hearing, while Marcus had a team of 8 attorneys from the city's most prestigious firm. My lawyer, fresh out of law school and overwhelmed, fumbled through basic procedures, while Marcus's team presented their case with theatrical precision. They painted me as a gold digger who'd manipulated a dying man, a mental case who'd threatened her husband, an unfit mother who put her own interests above her children. Witness after witness testified against me. The housekeeper claimed she'd seen me strike Marcus multiple times. The children's nanny said I'd been drinking heavily, though I hadn't touched alcohol in years. Even vendors from my charity events testified that I'd been erratic and unprofessional, their testimonies clearly purchased with promises of future Preston Industries contracts. Each lie was presented as fact, supported by documents that looked official, but contained carefully crafted distortions. The custody evaluation was the deepest cut. Dr. Jennifer Harrison, who'd been recommended by the court, but paid by Marcus through indirect channels I'd discover later, testified that the children showed signs of anxiety around me. She claimed Emma had expressed fear of my mood swings, and Ethan had mentioned Mommy's scary voice. These were complete fabrications, but presented with professional authority that made them seem credible. She recommended primary custody go to Marcus, with supervised visitation for me pending completion of anger management and psychological evaluation. Marcus's performance on the stand deserved an Oscar. He cried as he described fearing for his safety, his voice breaking as he talked about protecting our children from their unstable mother. He presented himself as a devoted husband who tried everything to help his troubled wife, but had finally accepted that divorce was the only option for everyone's safety. When asked about the inheritance clause in his father's will, he claimed it was George's way of protecting him from my manipulations, that his father had seen what I really was, but hadn't wanted to destroy his son's marriage while he was alive. The judge's bias was barely concealed. He sustained every objection from Marcus's team, while overruling everything my lawyer attempted. When I tried to present evidence of Marcus's affair with Diane, the judge ruled it irrelevant to the custody matter. When I attempted to explain the staged arguments, he warned me about making unfounded accusations. He even prevented me from submitting George's letters to me as evidence, claiming they were hearsay without proper authentication. The final decree was everything Marcus wanted. Divorce granted on grounds of irreconcilable differences with the notation that I'd exhibited concerning behavior. Primary custody to Marcus with supervised visitation every other weekend for me. I was ordered to pay child support despite having no income, a detail Marcus's lawyers had included, just to twist the knife deeper. The $210 million inheritance and control of Preston Industries remained entirely with Marcus. The marriage clause deemed invalid due to my alleged misconduct. I moved into a studio apartment in Queens, the only place that would rent to someone with frozen credit and no verifiable income. I got 2 jobs, one cleaning offices at night and another stocking shelves at a grocery store in the early morning. Every penny went toward the supervised visitation fees, $60 an hour, to have a stranger watch me hug my own children. Emma and Ethan were confused and distant, asking why I'd made Daddy so sad, why I couldn't come home anymore. Marcus had poisoned them against me so thoroughly that they flinched when I reached for them. The morning after the divorce was finalized, I was getting ready for my cleaning shift when someone knocked on my door. Edmund Hartley stood there looking every one of his 78 years, but with eyes sharp as ever. He handed me a sealed envelope identical to the one from George's will reading and said we have exactly 72 hours from the moment the divorce was finalized. George knew this would happen. He knew everything. I need you to come with me right now. In Edmund's car, I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note from George. My dearest Victoria, if you're reading this, then Marcus has done exactly what I feared he would. The man I raised as my son has become something I failed to prevent. But I've spent the last years of my life ensuring he cannot destroy you the way he destroyed others. Watch the video. Then let Edmund show you everything else. You have 72 hours to claim what is rightfully yours, not through marriage, but through justice. The video began with George sitting in his study looking directly at the camera with those penetrating eyes I remembered from our chess games. Victoria, by now Marcus has divorced you thinking he's kept everything. What he doesn't know is that the will contains a secondary clause that supersedes the marriage requirement. If Marcus divorces you for the purpose of claiming the inheritance, if he commits fraud or abuse in the process, everything transfers to you immediately. But you must present this claim within 72 hours of the divorce being finalized, or the clause expires forever. George continued explaining what he'd discovered about Marcus. There had been another woman before me, Sarah Blackwood, who dated Marcus in college. She died in what was ruled an accidental fall from Marcus's apartment balcony, but George had hired investigators who found evidence of a struggle. There were payoffs to witnesses' threats to Sarah's family to keep quiet, a pattern of violence Marcus had hidden behind his charm. George's voice broke as he admitted his failure as a father, his inability to stop the monster he'd created through neglect and ambition. The video revealed George's 3-year investigation into Marcus's true nature. Private investigators had documented Marcus's affairs going back to the 2nd year of our marriage. They'd recorded him discussing plans to divorce me once he figured out how to break the will's terms. There were photographs of him meeting with criminals who specialized in destroying people's reputations, recordings of him laughing about how easy it was to manipulate me because I always wanted to see the good in people. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. George had discovered Marcus's systematic theft from Preston Industries, millions siphoned through shell companies and hidden in offshore accounts. The fraud went back years long before George's death, but Marcus had been careful to frame other employees who'd been fired for his crimes. George had compiled every transaction, every forged signature, every destroyed document. He'd worked with federal investigators for 2 years building a case that would trigger the moment certain conditions were met. The divorce was that trigger. Sarah Blackwood's story was the most horrifying revelation. George had tracked down her best friend who'd been too terrified to speak 20 years ago. She revealed that Sarah had been pregnant when she died, that she'd been planning to expose Marcus's violence toward her. The friend had kept Sarah's diary where she'd documented the abuse, the threats, the fear she'd lived with. Marcus had gotten away with murder because George's money had protected him, but George had spent his final years trying to atone for that protection. George's chess lessons suddenly made sense as he explained his strategy. Every piece he'd taught me to move had been preparation for this moment. He'd known Marcus would destroy me to get the money, so he'd made sure I'd survive long enough to strike back. The supervised visitations, the public humiliation, even my poverty were all temporary sacrifices George had anticipated. He'd told Edmund to wait until I'd lost everything before revealing the truth, knowing that only then would I have the strength and rage necessary to fight Marcus without mercy. The Swiss bank account George had established contained $5 million, enough to fund my legal battle and survive until the inheritance transferred. But more importantly, George had been recording everything in his final years. Hidden cameras in his office captured Marcus admitting to crimes, bragging about his plans for me, even confessing to Sarah's murder during a drunk conversation with a college friend. The recordings were all legally obtained and admissible as evidence since George had been recording his own property and conversations he was party to. Edmund then revealed his own role in George's plan. He'd been more than just a lawyer. He'd been George's confidant and protector of this evidence. For 3 years he'd watched Marcus destroy me, unable to intervene until the exact moment George had specified. He showed me rooms full of documents, hard drives of recordings, evidence that would not only restore my inheritance, but put Marcus in prison for life. Edmund's own son James, a federal prosecutor, had been secretly assigned to the case, waiting for the signal to act. George had identified 13 other victims of Marcus's schemes over the years. Employees fired for Marcus's embezzlement, investors ruined by his fraud, women abused and silenced with payoffs. George had found them all, documented their stories, and set aside funds to compensate them from Marcus's personal assets. He'd turned his son's cruelty into a comprehensive case that would destroy not just Marcus, but everyone who'd enabled him, including Patricia, who'd been embezzling from the company's charitable foundations for decades. The federal investigation had been sealed for 3 years, waiting for activation. George had negotiated immunity for Preston Industries in exchange for his cooperation, ensuring the company and its employees would survive Marcus's downfall. Every crime had been documented, every prosecutor briefed, every judge selected for their inability to be corrupted. George had essentially built a perfect trap that Marcus had walked into the moment he divorced me to claim his inheritance. The recording devices in Marcus's office and car had captured everything from the divorce planning forward. His conversations with Diane about fabricating evidence, his payments to witnesses for false testimony, his detailed plans to destroy me were all recorded in his own voice. He'd even bragged about what he'd do with the money once I was gone, how he'd sell Preston Industries to the highest bidder and live like a king. Every word was evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted theft of $210 million. Edmund showed me the actual will's complete text, not the version Marcus's lawyers had seen. The secret clause was hidden in seemingly standard legal language that only activated under specific conditions. George had written it, knowing that Marcus's arrogance would blind him to the trap. The clause stated that any attempt to circumvent the marriage requirement through divorce fraud or harm to Victoria Preston would result in immediate and irrevocable transfer of all assets to Victoria, with Marcus prohibited from any appeal or legal challenge. The letter to prosecutors would be delivered the moment I claimed the inheritance. It contained George's deathbed confession about covering up Sarah's murder, his request for justice, and all evidence needed for immediate arrests. George had even arranged for simultaneous raids to prevent destruction of evidence, coordination with international agencies, to freeze offshore accounts and media packages, to ensure public pressure for prosecution. He'd thought of everything, planned for every contingency, all to protect me and get justice for Sarah. As I sat in Edmund's office surrounded by the evidence of Marcus's evil and George's redemption, I realized the old man had been teaching me more than chess. He'd been teaching me that sometimes you have to sacrifice everything to win the war, that patience and planning defeat immediate gratification, that the most powerful moves are the ones your opponent never sees coming. He'd made me the queen on his board, hidden and protected until the perfect moment to claim victory. We filed the inheritance claim at the courthouse with 43 hours remaining on George's deadline. The clerk's eyes widened as Edmund presented the sealed documents that had been waiting in the court's vault for 3 years, placed there by George through legal channels Marcus never knew existed. Within an hour, federal agents were executing warrants at Preston Industries, Marcus's homes, and every business associated with his fraud. The timing was so precise that Marcus was actually in a board meeting discussing the company's sale when FBI agents walked in with handcuffs. The media explosion was immediate and devastating. Someone Edmund never admitted who had leaked the entire story to every major news outlet simultaneously. The headlines screamed about billionaire heir's spectacular downfall, murdered girlfriend's justice after 20 years, and father's ultimate revenge from beyond grave. Photos of Marcus being arrested at his victory celebration with Diane and their conspirators became the most shared images on social media. Patricia's arrest for embezzlement at her charity luncheon was particularly satisfying to watch. The emergency injunction freezing Marcus's assets was granted within hours. Every account, property, and investment was locked down before he could move a penny. Diane Chambers was arrested at her law firm, charged with conspiracy fraud and fabrication of evidence. The other lawyers who'd helped destroy me faced immediate disbarment proceedings. The judge who'd shown such bias in our divorce was under investigation for taking bribes, his career destroyed by the evidence George had collected of his corruption. My first act as the rightful heir was to call my children's school and inform them that the custody arrangement had changed. The principal, who treated me like a criminal just weeks before, stammered apologies and congratulations. Emma and Ethan were confused when I picked them up, having been told by Marcus that morning that they'd be moving to Switzerland with him and Diane. I knelt down to their level and promised that I would tell them the truth when they were ready. But for now, Mommy was back, and no one would separate us again. The Preston Industries board meeting where I assumed control was something from a movie. I walked in wearing the same dress I'd worn to my last charity event before my world collapsed my head high despite the whispers. Marcus's allies scrambled to distance themselves, while George's old friends welcomed me with genuine warmth. I announced that the company would be restructured to focus on ethical practices and charitable giving, that the culture of greed Marcus had fostered was over. Several board members resigned on the spot, rather than face investigation into their own crimes. Marcus's trial became a national sensation. He faced charges of murder, fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, witness tampering, and assault. The prosecution presented George's evidence with surgical precision, each piece building an undeniable case. When Sarah Blackwood's diary was read in court, several jurors cried. When the recordings of Marcus laughing about destroying me were played, even his own lawyers looked disgusted. His attempts to paint himself as a victim of his father's manipulation fell flat against the mountain of evidence showing his calculated cruelty. I testified on the trial's final day, calmly recounting our life together, the gradual revelation of his true nature, the systematic destruction he'd orchestrated. I didn't cry or rage. I simply told the truth in the same voice I'd once used to read stories to sick children. I looked Marcus in the eye as I described finding his Operation Freedom document, watching him shift uncomfortably as his plan was exposed in detail. When asked if I had anything to say to him personally, I simply said that his father had loved him enough to stop him, which was more mercy than he'd shown anyone. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Marcus received life in prison without the possibility of parole, his expensive lawyers unable to argue against George's meticulously collected evidence. Diane received 25 years for her role in the conspiracy. Patricia got 15 years for embezzlement and conspiracy to commit fraud. The other conspirators received various sentences, their careers and reputations destroyed. Justice for Sarah Blackwood had taken 20 years, but it had finally arrived. I used my new resources to transform Preston Industries into what George had envisioned. We created a foundation for abuse survivors with $100 million endowment. Every employee Marcus had wrongfully terminated was offered their job back with full back pay. The investors he'd defrauded were made whole from his personal assets. The company pivoted towards sustainable manufacturing and ethical practices, becoming a model for corporate responsibility. George's portrait in the boardroom now had a small plaque beneath it reading, "Redemption is possible until your last breath." My children slowly learned the truth about their father through careful therapy and age-appropriate honesty. They struggled with anger, confusion, and grief for the father they'd thought they knew. but they also began to remember their grandfather's love, the chess games, the stories, the way he'd protected them, even after death. Emma eventually wrote a letter to Marcus in prison, not forgiving, but seeking closure. Ethan chose to never acknowledge Marcus's existence, changing his last name to my maiden name when he turned 18. The first year as CEO of Preston Industries was like learning to breathe again after nearly drowning. I made mistakes, trusted the wrong people occasionally, but always remembered George's chess lessons about thinking 3 moves ahead. The company transformed from a cutthroat corporation into a place where employees felt valued and protected. We instituted profit-sharing, comprehensive healthcare and educational programs that Marcus would have mocked as bleeding heart nonsense. Our profits actually increased as employee loyalty and innovation soared. Dating seemed impossible after what I'd survived. Trust felt like a luxury I couldn't afford, every kind gesture suspicious, every compliment potentially manipulative. But Edmund's son James had been there through the trial, initially as a prosecutor, then as a friend who understood trauma. He was a high school history teacher who'd chosen education over his father's legal empire, a man who found joy in teaching teenagers about the past's lessons. Our relationship grew slowly from shared dinners discussing the case to quiet walks, where we talked about everything except Marcus. James never pushed, never demanded more than I could give. He won over Emma and Ethan not with expensive gifts, but with patience and genuine interest in their lives. He attended Emma's violin recitals and helped Ethan with his science projects, becoming a steady presence without trying to replace anyone. When he finally kissed me 2 years after the trial, it felt like awakening from a nightmare I hadn't realized I was still living. He proposed at George's grave, saying he wanted to make that promise where my protector could witness it. Our wedding was small, just family and close friends in the garden where George had taught me chess. Edmund officiated, crying through the entire ceremony. Emma and Ethan walked me down the aisle, their acceptance of James the only blessing I needed. We honeymooned in Ohio, visiting my parents' graves, introducing them to the man who'd helped me find peace. James understood that my past wasn't something to overcome, but to integrate, that Marcus's betrayal had shaped, but not broken me. The annual visits to George's grave became a family tradition. I'd bring chess pieces and play a game against myself while talking to him about the company, the children, the life he'd made possible. On the 5th anniversary of his death, I found a letter hidden in the base of his favorite chess set, one Edmund swore he knew nothing about. George's handwriting was shakier than I remembered, but his words were clear as ever. The letter read, "My dearest Victoria, if you're reading this, then everything worked as I planned, and you've not only survived, but thrived. I need you to know that using you to stop Marcus was the hardest decision of my life. I saw your pure heart that first day you met him, and I knew both that he would destroy you, and that you would be strong enough to survive that destruction. I'm sorry for not warning you, but you would have tried to save him, and some souls are beyond redemption. Marcus was lost to me long before you arrived, consumed by a darkness I failed to recognize until it was too late. You were never just a tool in my plan, Victoria. You became the daughter I wished I'd raised, the heir I should have had. Watching you with the children, seeing your compassion, even for those who wronged you, observing your strength in the face of Marcus's cruelty, I knew I was right to choose you. The company, the money, the power, none of it matters compared to the legacy of kindness you've created. Marcus would have sold Preston Industries for parts, but you've transformed it into something that helps thousands of families. I know you've wondered why I didn't just disinherit Marcus directly. The answer is that he would have contested it, tied everything up in courts for decades, and destroyed the company in the process. But more importantly, I needed him to reveal his true nature publicly, to face justice for Sarah and the others. Only by letting him believe he'd won could I ensure his complete defeat. You were the perfect partner in this plan, because your genuine goodness made his evil impossible to hide. Please forgive an old man's manipulation, even if it came from love and necessity. Take care of those grandchildren who carry both Preston darkness and your light. Ensure they know that wealth means nothing without wisdom, that power, without compassion, is just tyranny. Teach them the chess lessons I taught you, But more importantly, teach them the kindness I never showed Marcus. Break the cycle. I perpetuated through neglect and ambition. My greatest accomplishment wasn't building Preston Industries or accumulating wealth. It was recognizing your worth and ensuring you'd survive to claim it. The will that saved you was never about money, Victoria. It was about my will to see justice done, my will to protect the innocent, my will to find redemption through your success. You were my second chance at raising a child, right? Even if I could only protect and guide from the shadows. Live well, my dear daughter, in all but blood. Love freely. Despite what Marcus did. Trust again, even though it was betrayed. Build the family that I failed to create. And sometimes when you're playing chess with the grandchildren, remember that the most powerful piece on the board isn't the queen or king, but the player who sees the whole game. You see it all now, Victoria. Play it well. That letter stays in my desk drawer read whenever I doubt myself or the path forward. Marcus sends letters from prison that I burn, unread his words, holding no power over me anymore. Patricia died in prison 3 years into her sentence alone and bitter to the end. Diane was released early for cooperation, but disappeared into obscurity, her legal career destroyed. The other conspirators scattered like roaches when light finally shone on their deeds. Emma is at Harvard now, studying law with plans to become a prosecutor, like the ones who brought her father to justice. She says she wants to be the voice for victims who can't speak for themselves to ensure no one else loses their mother to lies and manipulation. Ethan is at MIT developing sustainable technology that would make George proud. He never speaks of Marcus, but keeps a photo of George on his desk, his grandfather's inspiration driving him toward innovation with integrity. James and I had another child, a daughter we named Georgia after the man who saved us all. She'll grow up knowing that family isn't just blood, but the choices we make to protect each other. She'll learn chess from her mother and history from her father, understanding that both past and future matter less than present choices. She'll inherit not just money, but the knowledge that wealth carries responsibility to lift others. Preston Industries is now the largest employer of formerly incarcerated women in the country, offering second chances to those who've paid their debts. We fund legal aid for divorce cases where abuse is suspected, providing the quality representation I couldn't afford. The Victoria Preston Foundation has helped over 10,000 children learn to read, each book a small victory against ignorance and poverty. George's money has become a force for healing rather than harm. Sometimes I dream about the woman I was before Marcus, naive and trusting, believing love conquered all. I don't miss her innocence, but I honor her hope. That hope survived everything Marcus threw at it, transformed by fire into something stronger. I'm no longer the charity worker who fell for a billionaire's charm, nor am I the victim he tried to create. I'm the woman George Preston chose to carry his legacy, the mother who fought back, the survivor who refused to let betrayal define her limits. The last time I visited George's grave, I brought the final divorce decree and burned it at his headstone, watching the lies turn to ash and drift away on the wind. I told him about each life his plan had saved, each family. His money now supported each child who could read, because his foundation paid for books and teachers. I thanked him for seeing in me what I couldn't see in myself, for trusting me with not just his fortune, but his redemption. As I left the cemetery that day, I realized the secret clause in George's will had never been about legal technicalities or inheritance law. It was about the clause written in every human heart that says, we deserve justice, that evil shouldn't prosper, that love is worth fighting for, even when it seems lost. George knew Marcus would trigger that clause the moment he chose greed over family cruelty, over kindness, betrayal, over bond. The will that saved me was really George's will that good should triumph, even if he wouldn't live to see it. My story could have ended with those pills in Sarah's guest room, another casualty of a rich man's cruelty. Instead, it became proof that sometimes the universe conspires to protect the innocent, using flawed instruments like George to deliver perfect justice. Every morning when I wake up in my home, when I kiss James goodbye, when I run a company that helps, Instead of harms, I remember that my happiness is George's final chess move checkmate from beyond the grave. To anyone watching who's been betrayed by someone they trusted, who's lost everything to another's greed, who's been told they're worthless by someone who promised to love them, know this: your value doesn't decrease based on someone's inability to see it. Sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the greatest freedoms. Sometimes the death of who you were makes room for who you're meant to become. And sometimes, just sometimes, justice comes wrapped in a will that seems like a trap, but is actually a key to everything you deserve. What would you do if you discovered the person trying to destroy you had accidentally handed you the weapon for their own defeat? Have you ever had someone unexpected become your guardian angel? Share your own stories of justice and redemption in the comments below. If this story gave you hope that truth eventually wins, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of people who refuse to let betrayal be their ending. Share this with anyone who needs to remember that sometimes the darkest moments are just before the dawn breaks. Thank you for watching, and remember, the will to survive is the strongest force in the universe. Stronger than any will written on paper. Stronger than any betrayal, stronger than any amount of money. Stay strong, and never forget that your story isn't over until you decide it is.